While I was working on this, I was reminded of a story of a Sunday school teacher who once upon a time asked her class, just as she was about to dismiss them to go to church, "Now, does everyone understand why it's so important that we are quiet during church?" And little Johnny raised his hand and said, I know, it's because people are trying to sleep. Okay. It seems like there's a lot of people out there who find themselves agreeing with George Burns when he said that a great sermon has a great beginning and a great ending and keeps them as close together as possible. Those jokes aside, I really hope everyone's a little bit more enthused for today's message than that, at least. And so, coming off of this long series I just did, I found myself thinking of favorite characters in the Bible. And you may have a favorite character that you already can think of. You can't choose Jesus, that's not fair. Some other favorite character from the Bible, and for reasons I just can't even explain to you, I find myself drawn to a guy named Joseph. I don't know why. Can't imagine why that would be. To clarify, I mean the Old Testament Joseph, not the New Testament Joseph. Nothing wrong with him, just focusing on the other one. We learn Joseph's story from our earliest days in Sunday school. We talk about a colorful coat and a trip to Egypt and a big family reunion and how everything all turns out well in the end, and it's a happy little story. Well, that's not really, I think, what we're supposed to get from the story of Joseph. Joseph has a lot more to teach us, and I think that by delving into that today, we're going to learn a lot more. I think specifically Joseph can teach us about faithfulness. So let's examine what it means to have great faith through discouragement and disappointment by looking at the life of Joseph. However, before we get into the scriptures, would you please join me in prayer this morning? Dear Heavenly Father, as we gather here this morning, we've praised you for your majesty, your power, and your love through song. Lord, our lives are a strange and baffling mix of highs and lows, goods and bads, and it can be very hard to maintain our faith and our relationship with you strong in our worst times. Lord, we ask for renewed strength and enhanced faith. And in those moments when we struggle and we lose heart and we start to lose our hold on you, bolster our spirits and our souls and help us not to just carry on, but to remain close to you, our faith strong in you. Please bless me as I deliver this message, and may all who hear it be blessed and encouraged. I pray all of this in the name of your Son and our blessed Savior, Jesus. Amen. So we're going to start with Genesis chapter 37. And to begin, I'd like to introduce our main character. In case you have forgotten, Joseph begins the story as a young man of 17. Now, as a bit of backstory, Joseph's family, in case you've forgotten, Joseph comes from a really troubled family situation. By anyone's measure, Joseph's family has a lot of problems. As a young man, his father, Jacob, tried to trick his father, Isaac, into giving him the family fortune instead of his older twin brother. And when that plan fell apart, Jacob had to run for his life when his twin brother vowed to murder him. He flees more than 200 miles on foot, where Jacob finds a place amongst his mother's relations, only to have his uncle cheat him and essentially treat him as a slave. While there, Jacob will marry 2 of his cousins and take on 2 more concubines. Now, Jacob, who we also know as Israel, is father over a very troubled family. Sons from 4 different mothers. Between all of them, they have 12 sons and 1 daughter, all of them living and working together, and there was a great deal of rivalry and competition, as I'm sure you can see. To make matters maybe more difficult, Jacob has a clear favorite. His first son by his most beloved wife, Rachel, Joseph. And Jacob isn't shy about showing this favoritism either. He doesn't pretend everyone's equal while secretly having a favorite. He quite blatantly has a favorite. He has this special coat made up for Joseph as a symbol of this favoritism. This is one great big messed up family. And I am sure most of us would not call this a situation that we would want for ourselves. And yet our God uses this situation to produce one of the most remarkable figures of the early Bible, one of the greatest life stories anywhere in the Bible. Perhaps God's making a point here. Your messed up family doesn't preclude God using you. You're not forever doomed just because you came from a bad situation. God is dependable, and he's dependable enough to not give up on you if you don't give up on him. Now, that coat I mentioned is actually a very important symbol. Because Joseph is the favorite son, Jacob has chosen him as his heir, even though he's not the eldest. Now, that garment in question is the outward symbol of this decision. So not only Jacob, but now Joseph and everyone else are well aware that Joseph is not only favored, he's also now the inheritor. What this really means in a day-to-day application is Joseph has become a sort of a manager / right-hand man to his father. And that means that Joseph is the management in the family business, and the rest of the brothers are the labor. I think you can probably understand why this might be hard for them. In Genesis chapter 37, verses 5 through 11, we see how God has intended Joseph for something great. And apparently he wants Joseph to know this in advance. So turning to Genesis 37, 5 through 11, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Would you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I've had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were all bowing down to me." And he told this to his father as well as his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you've had? Would your mother and I and your brothers all actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, in that translation, it's the same wordage as when Mary kept those things and treasured them up in her heart. Means essentially the very same thing. Okay, Joseph has been given a glimpse of how the future should go. But can't we all at least agree that Joseph has shown at least a great lack of tact in sharing his dreams? I think maybe what this shows us is that as a very young man, Joseph's favored status has fueled his ego, and that at least as a very young man, he's got a bit of a pride problem. Well, hang on, the Lord is going to deal with his pride problem soon enough. You see, Joseph's brothers are off with the flocks one day, and they have traveled about 50 miles from home with them. And so Jacob, the father, needing to keep track of everything that's going on, sends his right-hand man, his manager, out to manage how things are going. And quite obediently, Joseph sets out. Now, I remind you, at this point in his life, Joseph's life cannot get any better. Things are really, really good for Joseph. Let's pick up the story from Genesis 37, verses 18 through 28, just as his brothers see him coming in the distance. "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say some ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' And Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And then they sat down to eat their meal. And then they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who then took him to Egypt." talk about a reversal of fortunes. From favored son, managerial status, to sold into slavery. That's a bad afternoon, no matter how you look at it. But let us remember briefly, at least, that those brothers were actually planning to kill him. That was their first thought. And that really needs to shock us. Just because we know that that isn't what happens in the end, let's remember that that was their first plan. Now, yes, Reuben wasn't quite as corrupted, but he also failed to stand up to the rest of his brothers. He wanted to try to foil their plans in secret. So as far as I'm concerned, Joseph's brothers are guilty of murder, although they quite stopped just short of the deed itself. Actions and intentions are quite similar in the sight of God, and in their hearts, they had killed him. It wasn't the voice of conscience that won out here. This was the triumph of one sin, the sin of greed, over another sin, the sin of malice. Hardened hearts they must have had indeed. For we know that Joseph was alive down there in that cistern, and later on in the story we learned that he was actually pleading for them to let him out. And so they sat there and ate their lunch all the while listening to their brothers' cries for help from the cistern. And yes, apparently Joseph did cry and call for help from his brothers. But you know what is never even hinted at? Joseph never cursed God, questioned God. I mean, talk about a discouraging and a disheartening time, and Joseph never lost faith in his God. Now, once he's in Egypt, Joseph is going to be sold to a high official by the name of Potiphar. Even in the midst of this horror, God will not depart from Joseph. Now, in some ways, the story is going to get worse from here, but when it does, God will still be there with Joseph. Because God is working, and not just on Joseph's behalf, he's also working for his larger plan. Now, we find out that Potiphar actually thought very highly of Joseph. Genesis chapter 39, verses 2 through 6 say, "The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household to all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on Potiphar and all that he had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate." So yes, Potiphar is pleased with Joseph, and he has reason to be, no doubt. But really, isn't it God who should be getting some of the credit here, if not all of the credit here, really? Joseph is a slave now. His life and his choices are not his own anymore. Joseph's ordeal is obviously immense. And yet God never abandoned him, not even in the smallest way. You see, as far as Joseph is concerned, if God is going to allow me to be a slave, then I'm going to be successful even if it's as a slave. I'll be the best slave I can be. You know, I think we often complain to God when he's put us in some terrible or difficult place. And yet God's will is that we trust him to bless us and make us successful in his sight in whatever situation we find ourselves. So yeah, Joseph has fallen very far from his favored son status, and yet we see Joseph never once blame God, curse God, question God. Joseph's rock-solid faith remained solid and strong. God blessed him, and everyone who treated him well apparently is in addition. So Joseph's had a major reversal, but he's starting once again to make a good spot for himself through hard work and God's blessings. This is actually an 11-year period of his life, if you do the math around it. Once again, Joseph's good position, achieved with hard work, blessed by God, and a strong, unwavering faith, is going to be obliterated. After 11 years of working for Potiphar, the biblical account shows us that Potiphar's wife created designs on Joseph. And when he spurned her advances, she went for revenge. Genesis chapter 39, 17 through 20 tells us what happened when Potiphar got home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And when his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. 11 years of Joseph's life, 11 years of devoted service, 11 years spent earning that top place in Potiphar's household, flushed right down the you-know-what, as it were. You know what? I think we'd forgive Joseph if he had a bad reaction to this episode. We would understand if he decided to throw a pity party, even question God at this time. And yet, you know what? Genesis chapter 39, verse 20 through 23 reads, "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all that was held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." Once again, Joseph is going to resolve to be a successful man, even if it's as a prisoner. I'll be the best prisoner I can be. He never ever seems to complain. He never seems to doubt in God, and God continues to bless Joseph for these qualities. Now, just when you think that Joseph's story must be coming to its end, he's stuck in a prison, something miraculous happens. Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker are both thrown in prison together with Joseph. And Joseph gets to know them, and then one night they both have a set of troubling dreams. Genesis chapter 46 through 19 tells us this story. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there was no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and the clusters turned into ripened grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me, show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcefully carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon." Now when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for the Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Okay, there are several things we need to unpack from this. The first thing I want to point out is that we know Joseph is still near to God in this episode because Joseph himself states interpretations belong to God, and then says, "Tell me your dreams." See, Joseph is confident in his relationship with God, enough so he believes God will give him the correct interpretation. He didn't say, "Well, you should probably pray to my God about it." He steps out in great faith, relying on his God to help him out. This is how I just know Joseph never gave up on God through all of his troubles. Because while he is still in prison, he is still close enough to him to trust in his faithfulness to follow through. I also think this gives us a window into Joseph's heart. You know, men who are consumed with anger and bitterness and pitying themselves don't generally take a great concern for the personal problems of others. And yet Joseph has noticed these 2 men are sad and dejected and asks them what's wrong. He cares what's wrong with them. Another important point is that Joseph is trying to give God the credit for the interpretation. He's not trying to keep it for himself. And then finally, I think we all noticed this part, Joseph doesn't shy away from the bad news. He doesn't candy coat it to make the man like him. He tells him exactly what God wanted him to. If Joseph had any doubt at all as to the validity of the interpretations, he would have given them both a positive result of some kind, hoping at least one of them would have gotten a good result, and maybe that would help him out. But no, Joseph knows that God will tell him truly what to say and faithfully relays that message. And of course, we all know God's interpretations hold true. The cupbearer is restored, the baker is executed. And then Genesis chapter 40, verse 23 tells us what happened immediately next. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Or maybe he didn't choose to remember him. I don't think he actually forgot that he existed. Joseph has only asked for that one thing, to be remembered to Pharaoh. And the cupbearer can't even do that much. Here, Joseph is wronged again. He was hoping that cupbearer's kindness might mean his release from prison, but that was not to be. Joseph is going to linger in that prison a little longer. How on earth did Joseph endure this without losing his faith in God? How did he avoid the conclusion that God is just toying with him, raising his hopes just to crush them again? How did he keep from becoming a bitter, vengeful, angry man as he faced the prospect of dying in a dungeon in a foreign country? The only answer I can come up with is iron-willed faith, and that's all I've got, and I think that's the right answer. See, Joseph knows that he can trust God. And at the same time, Joseph certainly can't count on anyone else. The next 2 years must have been very depressing times. Joseph, no doubt, had gotten his hopes up only to have them dashed again. How long he spent before he gave up on that cupbearer, we don't know. But you know what I do know? He never once gave up on God. Joseph's faith was unshakable even in the worst times. Joseph has a faith that can withstand and endure in the long term. Now, let's see how Joseph's faith is finally rewarded. Genesis chapter 41 begins by telling us that Pharaoh had a couple of troubling dreams himself. And he was bothered by them, so he called together all the wise men, and none of them could give him an interpretation. So Genesis chapter 40, verses 9 through 13, finally tells us, "Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, 'Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each of us the interpretation of his dream. And those things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled.'" So finally, the cupbearer has remembered. I assume he probably thought he would never have need for Joseph's dream interpretations again, and it was safe to just pretend he had never been there. But lo and behold, now Pharaoh has need for Joseph. So Joseph is sent for, cleaned up, and brought in to see the Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 40, 15 through 16 records the exchange. "Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.' 'I cannot do it,' Joseph replied to Pharaoh, 'but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires.'" I just love the fact that Joseph is giving God the credit again here. Pharaoh has just given Joseph a golden opportunity to glorify himself, but Joseph refused. He did not use this as an opportunity to elevate himself before Pharaoh, only to glorify God. The temptation to claim this as some amazing personal gift and use that to try to get out of prison had to have been immense. And yet we never even get a hint that Joseph even thought about doing that. Joseph voluntarily tells Pharaoh that it is not some personal gift, it belongs to his God. And of course, God provides Joseph with the interpretation for the dreams. We all know of the 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh is obviously impressed with Joseph. He places him as his second in command. Historically, Egyptian pharaohs had right-hand man advisors known as viziers. I don't know for sure. We don't have the evidence necessarily. I've always wondered if that's technically what Joseph has just become here. So now Joseph is second to the king. He's given a wife and an enormous power and authority. And in the following 7 years of plenty, Joseph oversees the stockpiling of the food. And in those years, he has 2 sons, Genesis chapter 40, 51 through 52 tells us about them. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." I think it's important to note that these are Hebrew names. These are not Egyptian names. Joseph is preserving his heritage to the next generation. Also notice that both of these names refer to Joseph's relationship with God. Manasseh basically translates to forgetful, and Ephraim basically translates to fruitful. And then Joseph explains why he chose both of those names, and in both cases, it was because of God. So in conclusion, Joseph's life story should, I believe, be an inspiration to us. He's a paragon story, a man to admire, a man to try to emulate. You know, it would have been really easy for him to give up faith, curse God, and wallow in despair. All through Joseph's experiences, there is no indication he ever even thought about heading down that path. Instead, both by example and by word, he held to the conviction that God reigns. I think Joseph's life story tells us a great deal about how God fulfills his word. You know, ultimately, Joseph's brothers weren't trying to defeat Joseph's hopes and dreams for the future. They were trying to defeat God's revealed will for the future, and God never fails. The essential message of Joseph's entire life can be found in a verse in the New Testament, Romans 8:28. Most of you probably already know it. "And we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." You know, it's the plain hard truth that people are going to fail you, disappoint you, leave you hanging out to dry. Let that drive you to God. In other words, let the disappointment and the disillusionment with people turn you to the goodness and the faithfulness to be found in the Lord. You know, throughout all of Joseph's life, he certainly learned that lesson. People will let you down, but God will never fail you. Look, I know that trials and tribulations and disappointment and discouragement and pain of all kinds are going to happen. They're going to happen to all of us. And I'm not trying to tell you they're not real and they're not significant, and I'm not trying to pass any kind of judgment on anyone who's ever struggled in hard times, because God knows how badly I failed my tests for years on end. What I'm trying to say is that the story of Joseph is trying to prepare us for just this sort of troubling situations. Show us that Joseph never wavered, never lost faith, and if he can do it, I think there's hope for the rest of us as well. If you need one specific biblical passage to spell it all out, Jeremiah 17, 5 through 8 does a really good job. This is what the Lord says. "Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws his strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert on a salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." I hope the example of Joseph has inspired you today. I hope it will inspire you when you need it the most. I hope it will help you maintain your faith in the hard times. Song leaders can go ahead and come back up. You know, this morning I wonder, are we capable of having such unwavering faith in God as Joseph did? Have you ever found yourself giving in to despair and losing faith, even just temporarily? I hope the story of Joseph reminded you of the constancy and dependability of God, even when it seems like all is lost. Do you need to come to the Lord today? Have you ever made that choice to accept him and forge a relationship with him? He's just waiting to prove his dependability to you. Give him that chance. Open your heart to the Lord of all heaven and earth today. Do so now as we stand to sing our invitation.